The book series I've written with Stephen Patrick, The Holocaust Engine, uses Christian teachings in roughly the same way that The Exorcist uses them, meaning that they form the backdrop, so the assumptions of the world and how it truly operates. But we never try and persuade the reader of the truth of Christianity or plot our story arcs in a way meant to teach Christian morals. This was intentional. We talked about it, since it probably would have been easier to have found a publisher in the realm of Christian Fic. But there was just one problem. I can't stand Christian fiction. And I meant to explain why in one short video, but as I outlined the topic, I realized unless I provide some serious context, none of what I'm going to say would make any sense. So I'm going to take one issue I have and use one example from Christian fiction over a series of videos and use these to lay out the problems inherent in the genre, while giving all kinds of historical backdrop for how we got here, because that's just what I do. And we're going to start with this. The book is The Shack, written by Paul Young, popular enough to get the major motion picture treatment, along with the usual criticism that gets attached to any well-known work of Christian fiction. And if you search YouTube for critiques of The Shack, this is what you'll find. This is the top result. Go down a little more and you get to The Shack, Witchcraft and Demon Doctrine. I think I'll pass on that one. But as you peruse the results, you'll notice a theme. Am I overreacting? Is it just this book? Well, let's pick another. People keep telling me I should read Ted Dekker. I wonder what his detractors would say about that. No, they don't go after his characters or prose or how his plot lines are overly simplistic or maybe overly complex. I don't know. No, I'm sure I'd find something along those lines if I looked hard enough, but just search author and criticism of Christian fic, and the term false teacher comes up again and again. And that's no matter who we're talking about. I laugh because it's inherently absurd, and I'll show you why in just a minute. But at the same time, as a history buff, it seriously rubs me the wrong way. I mean, go back between the 12th and 17th centuries, and that accusation got a lot of people barbecued. And I hate to see it thrown around so flippantly like we do these days, particularly when we're talking about works of fiction. In the Shack Movie Exposed video, the guy is organized enough to list out some of his issues, none of which are really much in the way of issues, but it gives me a chance to define my key term, which is that I'm going to keep calling the biblical worldview Hebrew. Now, what do I mean when I say something is Hebrew? Very much like saying it's biblical, but I want to be clear that I'm asserting that I believe that all 66 books in the Christian Bible present a single unified worldview that was held by the monotheistic Hebrew authors of the Bible. And for something to be heresy, it would need to conflict sharply with that worldview. So, what about these? Well, the first one falls flat on its face. It's just a reduction of Jesus' words in Luke 11. Same basic theme, the idea of a personal relationship over external behaviors or religiosity. The second one is in the Bible too. Surprise, surprise. And it's actually a theme. Jesus echoes this as well in his parable of the shrewd manager, when he points out that the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than the people of the light, as he says. And I'm not going to go into it any further at the moment, because the reason why believers would be less shrewd is actually the subject of the next video, complete with its own work of Christian fiction. But what about number 3? Well, it's certainly not the way the Hebrews would have presented it, but as a work of fiction, I certainly wouldn't call it heresy. You see, the story in the Shack revolves around a theophany, or an event where God interacts with the main character. Earlier in the video, our critic goes after the Shack for simply manifesting God at all, citing the passage where God tells Moses that no one can see God and live. What our critic seems not to realize is that right after he said that to Moses, God then did just that. He manifested himself to Moses in a limited fashion. So, is the Shack's presentation of God awkward? Yeah. Is it deserving of the barbecue treatment? Come on. As to number 4, every author has to leave out details, otherwise the book gets too long and our publishers get fuzzy. And 5, potentially, could be construed as just a restatement of number 1. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not defending the doctrine of the book, just pointing out that these heresy claims against any Christian author tend to be incredibly weak. Now, having said that, Is it true that the basic premise of the shack cannot be entirely reconciled with the Hebrew worldview? And our critic here comes pretty close to the central issue, but he never really hits it. You know who did hit it? And why it can't be reconciled? The Hebrews themselves. At the beginning of the book of Revelation, we're introduced to the 7 churches. Those 7 churches just happen to mirror the basic stages of religious evolution that can be seen all over the world from the point when Christianity first reaches the culture through a set of compromises as the Christians attempt to reach and embrace an ever-increasing percentage of the population until it finally ends up as just nothing more than a shell of its former self, the lukewarm stage in stage 7. Where a society might still check the box, Christian, but you could never tell. Now, there are 2 compromises that have already taken place by the time one arrives at the thought process like the one presented in the shack. The first is called the error of the Nicolaitans. What was this error, you ask? Well, early church historians tell us that the Nicolaitans had something like shrine prostitution as a part of their worship ceremonies. It seems bizarre now, but in ancient pagan societies where the city could have hundreds or even thousands of various temples and shrines, how was one supposed to get men to come and throw down their hard-earned drachmas? The answer in many cases was to combine religious ecstasy with the physical kind, so a temple/brothel. And historically, Catholic Europe did this very thing, evolving from running orphanages to, in many cases, actually pimping the girls out themselves. Yeesh. But even beyond that, the clear moral of this metaphor seems to be that one should be careful luring people into their churches with game nights and potluck dinners. There's a natural tendency at that point to conclude that the faith is about living it up rather than about sacrificing oneself. The second compromise, we are told, is tolerating that woman Jezebel. Now, there may have been a specific person of that name at that time in the city of Thyatira, but either way, the passage is clearly connecting that Jezebel to the Jezebel. And just who was the Jezebel? Well, biblical scholars like to call her a queen and the wife of King Ahab. No, that misses the point wildly. King Ahab did not have a wife. He had wives, lots of them, a harem of wives and concubines, which was what every king had at the time. Her power over the other wives and concubines seems to have come from the fact that she wasn't just a Baal worshiper, she was a priestess. And at that time, where the king of Israel and many of the people were converting to Baal worship, that would have made her a pope-like religious figure. She had power, and she wasn't supposed to under the Hebrew system. You see, the Hebrew system of governance was highly patriarchal, which among other things means led by a dude. It has an overriding foundation of responding to the question, what is actually more important, safety and security or pain and suffering? By always saying the first. And so you get this spare the rod, spoil the child way of looking at the world that says that human aggression, particularly male aggression, has to be disciplined and channeled into healthy outlets like defending the country. In a patriarchal system, the wolf is always at the proverbial door. And so it's a natural fit for a place like modern-day Israel, where the Jewish population lives under the constant threat of attack. This compromise is a compromise where people manage to convince themselves that they're not in any real danger. And in that world, masculinity really would be toxic, since there wouldn't be a valid justification for it. Discipline, if it doesn't serve any valid purpose, is just abuse. Now, we're told that this compromise brings 2 consequences. First, suffering for those who commit adultery with her, and second, death for her children, so her offspring, her progeny. How does this fit with the shack? It is the shack. A story about a man who loses a child to a heinous criminal act. Let's do this as a contrast. 1, patriarchal. Okay, here's an example of a patriarchal response. This is Paul Kersey. He lost some family too. His response, we'll just call it aggressive and leave it at that. He learned the world was a dangerous place. He responded accordingly, sort of. Now, compare. In the shack, our hero spends a weekend at a cabin with the Almighty and learns that God loves everyone no matter what they've done, which actually is consistent with Hebrew teaching. But his response to this bit of truth, not so much. In the movie, at the end, he's learned to forgive. And he's just driving the family off in a minivan with a contented grin on his face. The problem? Listen, I'm not saying become a killer vigilante, although that would have been a much more interesting ending. But, come on. Take up a new hobby. Get the family a new pet. Something to show that you've figured out that the world is a dangerous place and you want to protect your other still living children. Remember those consequences? The first one mirrors the adultery of Babylon that comes in the text later. In short, the loss of one's principles. And yes, that brings natural suffering for the people who live in a self-destructive manner. The second consequence, well, how would her offspring just up and die? Okay, that one's not hard. 5,000 years of recorded human history has an answer for that. Like Rome here, which spent the better part of 1,000 years as a patriarchal society, and during that time dominated everyone around them, then lost that patriarchal structure and spent the last part of their history getting snuffed out of existence. And so for the Paul Youngs of this world, who think that the Hebrew God delays judgment because he just can't bear to hurt any of his children, that's the major theme of the story, I leave you with this prayer from David, the man after God's own heart, because sometimes the kids just need a whooping. And for the critics splashing around heresy claims left and right, I leave you with this. You see, this is the part of Jezebel's story where she told the prophet Elijah she was going to kill him. We're told he then fled to Horeb, which is either another name for the biblical Mount Sinai or its sister peak. And I ask you, why did the biblical prophet flee on foot for 6 weeks, over a span of hundreds of miles, when all he had to do to get away from her was hide in the nearby cavernous hill country like David did from Saul? Remember that Jezebel was a priestess in a pagan religion, in other words, a sorceress. When she told him she was going to kill him, he wasn't just afraid of assassins. He was afraid of her putting a spell on him. So he fled to holy ground because he thought that God could protect him better there than he could anywhere else. He didn't understand that God was in complete control everywhere, and Jezebel was just confused. In other words, Elijah could be called a heretic. Same for Moses, who didn't understand that God is omnipresent, in other words, everywhere at all times. And so you can't see him with mortal eyes because that's not what eyeballs do. It turns out everyone not named Jesus has some funny ideas. We're all wrong about some things. That's why we're supposed to approach these things with a little humility, and maybe not be so quick on the draw to call people heretics. If I'm having my books critiqued, I'd like those critiques to focus on the literature. Who knows? I might learn something. I'm less thrilled about being branded a false teacher just because I don't agree with the critic on everything. This is David Reichert from The Bunker. Hit like and subscribe and click the notification bell, and we'll try and put out at least one video a week. Also, our pandemic horror series, The Holocaust Engine, is available September 14th. Link for pre-order down below.